The AWARE project's aim is to balance the public conversation about psychedelics, spread accurate information, and give a new face to psychedelia. We feel that this change will occur through connection and relationship, one individual at a time. We are calling on everyone whose lives have been improved through the mindful use of psychedelics to educate themselves and become ambassadors for the psychedelic experience. Show those around you that people who use psychedelics mindfully cross all social, racial, economic, and political boundaries.
Hi, everyone.
We froze.
Okay. So I'm Ashley. I'm the founder of the AWARE project. So excited for you. Excited for you all to be here for this important conversation. So the AWARE project, if you haven't been to one of our events, we're a psychedelic society here in Los Angeles and in San Diego, and we've been doing events monthly for about 3.5 years now. Yeah, a lot of events. And we do events here in Culver City, on the east side, and in San Diego. So if you have friends in different areas, go check it out. And the idea was basically to create community space for us to learn together. We bring speakers in to talk about various aspects of psychedelia to change the public conversation around psychedelics. So based off of kind of the discussion that we're having here today, we're kind of doing another series. So normally we do these psychedelic awareness salons, and we have a speaker come, and they do their spiel, and then we have questions, and da-da-da. This one is more of a community dialogue. So we have a panel. We're going to do kind of set bring some topics up, because we all have different expertise in sort of different areas of this, and then we want to open it up into the space to have people put in their perspectives, because this is something that we're all, dealing with together and all working through together. Logistically, we have one microphone. So I'm going to hand this across here. If you want to participate in the conversation, I would ask that please keep your comments to, short-ish. We want to make sure that there's space for everyone. Please keep this more towards, again, we're kind of winging this tonight, so I'm going to be kind of thinking of things as we go along here. But the idea is to be able to create a space where we're starting to come up with some solution-based things. And if there is a need for processing, if you've had an experience, then maybe there's a need for us to create a space for people to process, whether it's victimization or any other issues surrounding this. And then there may be other spaces for other things, and we can get into that more later. But we'd like to keep this sort of in a space of community solution finding. And we can, again, talk about this more in a bit, but my personal feeling is that solutions are best found when we're feeling centered and level-headed. Obviously, this kind of conversation can bring up a lot of feelings and emotions, and there can be a space for that that we could create. But in this space, if we are coming from a space of anger or pain, we are going to create anger and pain in our solutions, and it's going to come from a vindictive place. So I'm hoping that we can set a tone here that is a space with love and compassion as we, collectively heal and work through this shadow. So I think that's kind of about it. As far as and then we're kind of just going to go on a sort of brief bio here, and then Tony's going to talk a little bit more about sort of what we're doing here. I also run another group called the Inner Space Integration, where we have integration circles for people that have had big psychedelic experiences and they need support grounding in what they've had. So we have community circles. Carol is is right back there. She leads our circles. Just as other, if this is helpful for people, the other places that I've worked in this space is I've worked at an Ibogaine clinic in Mexico, and I also currently work for MAPS as part of their clinical trial of PTSD for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for the treatment of PTSD. So if you have questions around those types of things that kind of relate to what we're talking about here, I'm adding that into the mix as well. So next is Tony, and I'm really excited to have him here in this space.
Always a pleasure. So most of you know me. I'm the founder predominantly of I Am Life. I Am Life is what we call a conscious production company. We produce events that are all centered around the idea of interconnectivity, connecting people, there you go, connecting people to each other, to spirit, to the cosmos, through a synergy of indigenous wisdom and technologies and contemporary understandings of everything from quantum physics to mental health. Right? So our events are all focused on that. I'm also, relatively recently in the last 2 years, become a very public advocate for the legalization of all plant medicines in the context of what we call right relationship, which is something relatively lost in the West. The idea of having all plant medicines available at all the time for use, but with a cultural climate and consciousness that knows how to utilize them. And that's a process, but that's something that we are strong advocates for and are slowly facilitating through our work. Personally, I've been working with plant medicine, specifically ayahuasca, for the last 23 years, and have led retreats in lots of places where it's legal. And and with all of that, using social media and art and music as a platform to basically get those messages out, basically.
Hello, everybody. My name is Liana Sananda Giluli, and I want to start by saying that I'm really grateful to be here at the AWARE project, and I was around for the very beginning of supporting Ashley launching this 3.5 years ago, and it's incredible to see the growth and development and to witness this growth occur all over the world. There's now over 80 different psychedelic societies in different cities around the planet who are all communicating together, and it's just super powerful to watch this node grow and evolve. So thank you, Ashley. I have a background working in advocacy, mostly on the cannabis issue, and worked for a large investor network and venture group in that area. And currently I work for the MAPS organization, Multidisciplinary Association for Psychedelic Studies, as a development officer. And so part of the role there and part of the things that I'm becoming more and more engaged with is this question of how to safely onboard the masses to these new types of therapies that will become available. And what are the issues surrounding that, and how do we create standards and protocols and kind of do it right? There's a lot of people who care very deeply about how this will look in terms of making MDMA-assisted psychotherapy legal, and after that we have psilocybin therapy coming down the line right after, and all these other things. And so this conversation particularly is of extraordinary importance. I'm somebody, and as we've all discussed, who really sees the importance of self-regulating as a movement and as a community. And so I've been engaged in a lot of different conversations and efforts happening. I live currently in the Bay Area, and there's kind of an effort up there that's happening more on the underground, and then also looking to translate this into a larger structure where we can create tools to help ensure safety in our community. So yeah, thank you.
Sita, do you want to go now?
Yeah, am I going to roll right into my statement now, Ashley?
Sure. Yeah. Tony was going to just set the stage.
Introduce who she is.
Yeah, just do your quick introduction, and then Tony's going to say from your words. Does that make sense?
I'm sorry about because I'm just saying I have very little voice, so maybe do you want to just read my bio, and then when it's time for me to talk, I'll talk.
Yeah, good idea.
I don't have your bio. I mean, I can kind of read it. Okay. Or you could share your screen and I can read it for you. What would you like us to do?
Sorry. Okay, I will. So, okay. What are we doing? What are you asking of me right now? I'm sorry.
Like a minute or two.
Talk about
bio.
myself.
Just who you are and why you're on this panel.
Okay. And then
Tony's gonna say a few words about just why we're all gathered here today.
And then we'll do your statement first so that you can rest.
Okay, great. Thank you very much. Okay, awesome. All right, so I am Sita, And I have been working with indigenous plant medicine for 20 years. And I think one of the reasons why I'm on this panel is because I really am dedicated to cultivating entheogenic awareness in all of its facets. And I am a proponent, of moving in the direction of the legalization, as Tony mentioned, of plant medicines and what that looks like. But along the way, I also want people to be safe. I want people to be safe, and I want the plants to be safe. And I have spent a lot of time in Peru over the years in my training and my dietas, and I have seen firsthand what can go on in terms of how confusing it can be in these intercultural connections. And so hopefully I can offer a little bit of guidance. As Ashley said, I don't think we have any answers. This is really about like what the questions are going to be, so hopefully I can contribute to that a little bit. And I apologize for not being there, and as you can see, I'm pretty sick, so hopefully that will even make sense. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so Tony's going to...
Thank you. So here's the main reason we're here. And we're going to speak from a very local perspective. Something is happening in our community, and it turns out what's happening in our community is happening internationally, actually, all over the country. And it's all over the world. And the recent unfoldings of what's been happening in Southern California opened up the genie's bottle, and all of a sudden there's been a floodgate of reports about sexual abuse, basically, within the psychedelic and plant medicine communities. And for those of us that have been doing this for a lot of years, that conversation is always there, and it's always kind of hovering underneath, and always little isolated pockets here and there. And with the kind of psychedelic renaissance, this resurgence of interest in indigenous technologies and working with plants like ayahuasca, along with the exponential growth of that, there's also been exponential problems, right? As you all know, which we'll get into. But the thing I mostly want to stress is what Ashley was saying. This is a solution-based conversation, right? We want to most likely come up with what are the important questions we should be asking and looking at. And then collectively in the global community, start to come up with solutions, right? So it's not a place to air grievances, and complaints, because that really requires actually a support group, which is not what this is. And we definitely can direct you to support groups.
And we can create that.
Yeah, and create one based on if that becomes something that comes out of this forum, right? Just want to be clear about that, because the idea is that in taking responsibility, as the four of us do, for what we're calling self-regulation, we have to self-modulate the plant medicine and psychedelic communities. And the responsible thing to do when issues like this come up is for us to get together and basically have conversations, right? So just want to preface that's what we're doing tonight. We might have some answers to questions that are asked specifically, but we're definitely not here to give you solutions. We're here to be in the process and the conversation about it, right? So to get things rolling, there might be cases where it's appropriate to mention a name this evening. What we're going to ask in general is that you give an example of something that you've heard about or has happened, as opposed to, my friend Lydia went to this guy, Russell, and this is what took place, right? We're not here to victimize, or to make wrong anybody. We really just want, or out anybody, more importantly. We really just want to have examples that are really pointing to the conversation. So the one I'm going to bring up, just to get things rolling, is someone in the Southern California community who's relatively very popular facilitator. Over the last year and a half, other men in the community have gone to him and said, look, you really need to take stock of your actions, because we're starting to get reports back from women and their partners that you're actually moving into what is officially sexual abuse, right? And it looked like in these conversations that progress was being made. Then relatively recently, within the last 2 months, this person engaged in inappropriate sexual activity in the context of an ayahuasca ceremony. While the boyfriend was in the other room, he reported it, and now he's in jail. Right? We want to, people that work with plant medicines, with very rare exceptions, don't belong in jail. Right? That's why the self-regulation is so important. right? If we can come up with solutions on how to avoid people going to someone like that in the first place, or have ways of identifying people that are starting to move down that path early on, and as in a community, some way respond to that, that's what we're actually looking for, right? And there's models for that coming out of like ICEERs. What does ICEER stand for?
Give me a minute.
They're related to MAPS.
Yeah, they are. They're amazing too.
Well, they're not related to METS. It's the International Center for Ethnobotanical and
Studies.
education, research, and support.
Awesome.
It's a mouthful, and they do have a call-in number that if people have had a difficult situation,
right.
Whether it be with a practitioner or just a difficult experience and need help processing through that.
Awesome. Whoops. Should be that. There you go.
I guess you could call it.
Cool. Thank you so much. The reason why I bring them up is one of the conversations they're in, which is all of these conversations are leading into, is standardization of practice. You know, a lot of people have a lot of issue in the psychedelic plant medicine community with the idea of standardization, because by nature they're usually, pretty rebellious, right? And but face it, that's what we're always talking about. We all know what a good ceremony looks like. We know what good facilitation looks like. And at some point, as a maybe global, certainly national, plant medicine, psychedelic, advocacy, and I guess assistant therapy too. This idea of people should be able to at some point go somewhere and say, if you're brand new, it's like, what does a good, let's say, ayahuasca ceremony look like? What should I be looking at in terms of the facilitation, and the location? People contact me all the time, every week at this point, asking those questions. My friend is going down to Peru to work with so-and-so. Have you heard about them? Do they have a good reputation? So the last thing I'll say, the interesting thing about this case of the person I was just bringing up was, I met two of the women who were headed to one of his ceremonies that got canceled. And I had to explain to them what happened because they never got the information that it was canceled. And she pulls out her phone, and right there is a text from a friend of hers saying, hey, I'm just giving you a warning. This guy you're going to has a reputation of sexual abuse in ceremonies, right? So on one hand, I thought, that's great, the word is out, and we're kind of self-regulating. On the other hand, they went anyway, or were planning to. Right. Right? Yeah, and they were so grateful to find out that they were being spared what could have been a very traumatic experience. Yeah. So that said, I'm just giving some context about what kind of spurred this conversation, at least for me personally, and a lot of other things we'll hear about. But with that, before we get rolling, Sita would like to hear the statement that you prepared.
Yeah, thank you very much, and I do apologize that after I say my few small things, I'm going to have to go. Absolutely. But I'm very heartened by this conversation, and I believe it's one of the most important conversations we can be having, if not the most important conversation around psychedelics and plant medicine. And it always is interesting to me how we can see the reflections of the culture at large in our little subculture, and we have this incredible opportunity to do it differently. I think that what it starts with is open, clear communication. And for many of us, that can be really difficult, particularly when we're talking about a difficult topic. Tony just mentioned that these women, even in the face of being advised, hey, this guy has been known to sexually abuse people, we're going anyway. So I think that we need to be mindful of the capacity of practitioners and the idea of a ceremony being an enchantment. And so I think it's important to not mistake the practitioner for the plants, because it's, certainly the practitioner has a role in what's happening, but the plants themselves are the ones that are doing the work, so to speak. But this ability, our capacity and our willingness to speak about these things is key. And the other part of it is, if something does happen, tell someone. And that can be a really big deal. Maybe it's not somebody in the plant medicine community. Maybe it's a family member. Maybe it's a friend who isn't part of this. But I think that's another component, part of the conversation. This idea of a solution-based conversation, from my perspective, I think that, there are lots of, not a lot, but there are some good models that we can follow. The truth and reconciliation model, the restorative justice, which has to do with healing rather than punishing, or providing a pathway for openings and awareness to take place. So in our judicial system, it's one where there is an accused, and then there is typically a trial, and then there is a punishment. And, apart from my work with legal advocacy work for 25 years, until very recently, and what we have learned through victim outreach is that typically people want to have a conversation. That's where the healing takes place. Because when you separate, the perpetrator from the victim, to use the legal terms, then there's no connection and no possibility for the restoration of justice or truth. And so this idea of a solution-based conversation, I think we could be well informed, by, the truth and reconciliation committees that came out of post-apartheid South Africa, the restorative justice models that we're seeing here in the United States. And, and I'm going to offer this as a call to action. There may be somebody here who wants to do a little research and come up with an idea or two or four as to how we may employ that here in our community. But the first step really is in communication. I'm going to touch very briefly on how difficult it can be if we're dealing with a situation outside the country and across a language barrier. And I'm just going to say flat out, in Peru, it is not uncommon for there to be sexual transgressions by shamans and helpers. And it is not all that uncommon for there to be episodes or incidences of sexual assault. I'm going to make that as a statement. I've been traveling to Peru for a really long time, and I hear these stories all the time. And oftentimes what's attended with those stories is this notion that there was a provocation on the part of the victim. And I'm going to suggest that whether it's in Peru or in North America, even if a participant, the client, let's say, is the one who makes the move or the sexual advance, it is never okay for the practitioner to act upon that. We're dealing in situations where, the capacity for informed consent does not exist. And I'm going to suggest that the only time that there is informed consent is before you go to the ceremony, because once you're on site, you're already in the enchantment. Absolutely. Right? So the informed consent happens in advance. And so, again, I think that opening this conversation, around what does informed consent mean. I've worked with ICers, to have this practitioner's oath. And we all have a slightly version of it, but, the other component part, I think that's so important, and I'm sure you guys will talk about, you women, and then we'll talk about it tonight, is what are the questions that you need to ask in advance? What is the information you need to be gathering, and how can we call on the community to endorse people who we know are safe, and to work with people who are not, so that either they're not pouring or they become safe. So thank you very much for listening. I'm sorry I can't be there, but I look forward to hearing after the event all of your comments and ideas. And thank you, Liana and Tony and Ashley, for including me in this. And again, my apologies for not being able to be there.
So good. Thank you so much. Take care of yourself.
So I figure we can kind of just kind of go back and forth, but one of the things that came up for me in response to what Sita was saying was, I remember learning about these misbehaving shamans down in South America, and I had this moment, it was almost like a crisis of faith, because I was like, these are these like sacred medicines, how are people doing these things when they work in this field? And so, you know, well, they are sacred things, they're tools, and they are wielded by people. And people have, you know, various amount of work that they continue to do, and it's just because you're taking the medicine doesn't mean you're doing the work. As we all know about, you know, the conversations around integration, because you can drink as much as you want, or you can do all these things, but it doesn't necessarily mean that you're getting to the deeper parts of what you need to explore. And I think being a part of the community, being part of a community, having friends and therapists or mentors that can help show you your blind spots is something that we all need as we take these journeys further down.
Yeah.
I'd like to add that it's really important that we acknowledge exactly where we are as a movement right now as well. And that is to say that we're figuring this out, right? There's this emergent phenomena. It's super global. I just got back from Prague last night. I was at Beyond Psychedelics. It was really fascinating to connect with the global tribe there and to learn that a lot of people are facing very similar issues that we're addressing today. And so in these conversations and these dialogues that we're having, it makes sense that we should start working on tools that people can use. And so one of those tools would be some sort of reporting mechanism, some sort of way to support and empower the people who are safe, and to have some sort of information available about people who are not. And something that I was made privy to while I was in Prague was something called ayaadvisors.org.
Oh, great.
I don't know if either of you have heard about this. I hadn't either. And it's actually quite robust, and it's kind of like a Yelp review thing for practitioners and for retreat centers. And the newmundo.org, legal ones, and yeah, legal ones, which there are quite a number of. And so again, it's like here's a tool that we can start using and start to create information, because right now because of the legalization structure in this country and many other places, we don't have access to good information. It's hard to know. And so my thought about your friends who might have been going to this ayahuasca shaman anyways is that maybe they didn't trust their source, or maybe there was some, you know what I mean? It's hard to know when we're getting verified and valid and good information.
Or they had nowhere else to sit.
Yeah, or they had nowhere else to go, and that's a big one. That's a big one. Yeah. And so in the creation of standards and protocols, and also while maintaining diversity, there has to be an agreement about what is safe, no matter what. Even if you employ all sorts of wacky and random tactics in your ceremony, there's still this base level agreement of this is what safety looks like, this is what ethical practice looks like, here are the standards that everybody should agree to, much like this practitioner or shaman's oath that Sita was mentioning. And so I know that there is an effort being made. It is something that's actually required of the MAPS organization for MDMA-assisted psychotherapy, which says that here are the protocols, here are the standards, and everybody must adhere to these protocols in order to administer safely and effectively this type of therapy. But what's interesting is that the way psychedelics are going to be legal within the next few years, we're talking as soon as 2021, is going to be through a medical context with that sort of rigid safety measures and you know, insurance companies involved in all these things, or the spiritual access. Because currently in this country we have Santo Daime, we have San Pedro, we have UDV, yeah, we have the UDV. And so the way to access this treatment or these therapies or these plant medicines is going to be either through in the medical context or in the spiritual context. And so when you look at it like that, it becomes, you know, the underground is kind of left and it's off by the side, and it's even harder to get good information and clear information out to people, and to know who to work with and who not to work with in those contexts.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So one of the challenges before we launch into conversation, which I was thinking about on the drive here, Sita mentioned provocation and enchantment. They go hand in hand. When I said that the person I was mentioning didn't belong in jail, the reason I said that is he literally is suffering from addiction, right? And what he told a good brother of mine that went down to talk to him was, he said, look, you know, I feel bad, but there's this amazing, beautiful women coming to me, and they're like giving themselves to me in ceremony. And he, I think, which we'll talk about, a very inflated egoic state, actually felt like he was responding to their call, right? It's challenging to be a facilitator and to have people, particularly people you're attracted to, falling all over you. And, with that statement, I was sharing with Shireen on the drive here, is there ever a situation where it's okay for the facilitator to engage in sexual conduct in the ceremony? And the answer is, as Sita said, no, right? And for that very reason, people are in an altered state. In this case, I'll say women because it happens more often in my experience. Oftentimes in ceremony, women are liberating themselves from, a lifetime of oppression of sexuality, or trying to move into healthy balance with their attractions. And of course, you're imprinting on this, in a lot of cases, beautiful, example of a balanced male, right? And a facilitator can easily, in an inflated egoic state, take advantage of that or be misled by it, right? All the more reason for the level of integrity that must be maintained, right? And as Sita said, and I completely agree, the only time it's ever really informed is if that's the purpose of the ceremony. There's an informed consent prior to ceremony. The reason we're doing this is I want to engage in some sexual healing, right? And you've chosen the right person to do it. In that context, of course, that could happen. There really is no other context where it would be appropriate. So what we're dealing with tonight isn't those questions, right? It's really what happens when it does happen, and how do we regulate?
And I would say too is, as we, explore how we want to enter into this work, we need to be very aware of, when we're stepping into an altered state and when it's being facilitated, you're going through both your own death, you're birthing your new self, and you're this newborn child all at the same time. And so you take a hard look at who it is that's going to be there with you during all of those different processes. Do you feel safe with someone that has good boundaries that's going to be able to hold you in all of those different states? And if something doesn't feel right in that respect, the sort of blessing and curse that's kind of happening right now is the more popular these things get, the more there's a sort of a vacuum for more people to step into the space to become facilitators, which could be a bad thing because maybe you have a lot more people that are not trained enough or don't have a good integrity, but at the same time, there's also more choice now. So whereas you might, a lot of people may be in, as I mentioned before, maybe these people that wanted to go and sit with this person, they didn't really know where else to ask.
Yeah, they had no reference point.
They had no reference point. They don't have standards, and or maybe you go into a ceremony and you don't really know what's normal or what's safe because you don't have any context. And just like a baby duck or something, you kind of imprint on whoever introduces you to the medicine first because it's such a powerful enchantment. And so how do you, as people that are well-informed in this community, we need to be vocal about when people are interested in this work, helping them know the kind of questions to ask of someone before they're going to sit with them. And to that, that goal, there are a couple groups around the world, and then the AWARE Project now has a couple things on our website to help people in this process. So the Women's Visionary Congress has a good list of questions that you can look at to see if you, and how you would approach good and safe work. There's a group of 5MEO practitioners called the Conclave that have recently put out a document around safety protocols and integration around 5MEO work that we now have hosted on the AWARE Project website so that everyone can have access to that. Because that one is one, and we'll go into it in a little bit, is particularly sparking this conversation right now. And then we also have a safety bulletin that several of us in the community have been pulling together over the last couple of months to publish with a lot of things along this. So please stay tuned and please share these resources with your community and with people that are interested in this work so that we can keep getting the information out.
Great.
I just want to add one thing. Oh, yeah, just keep going.
It is everything that we get this right. If this goes off and there's more and more stories like this, and there's more and more trauma occurring, and there's more inappropriate use and misconduct around these sacred tools, it can have a extraordinarily damaging effect on our movement, on all the work that people are doing. And so it is just the most it's of critical importance that we are having this conversation and getting it right. And Ashley was speaking about some of the tools that are being put together, and what's amazing is witnessing that there's people in the ketamine community, there's people, so it's fascinating to watch kind of like the umbrella psychedelic practitioner and then break it down based on protocols, based on different ceremonies and substances and things like that. And so there is a very alive effort happening right now with practitioners in different areas of this who are starting to work together, taking the lead of the 5-MeO-DMT community, and practitioners who've come together with a set of protocols, which I totally recommend checking out. So I just wanted to emphasize that.
Yeah. Do you want to say anything more about that?
Yeah, so what was so fascinating about watching the response to the 5-MeO community is that there's been this, what I've been calling the 5-MeO Shaman Throwdown happening, on mostly on Facebook of all places. This is the world we live in. Yeah. And where there's this one practitioner who was called out after video surfaced of him using what appeared to be a cattle prod electrifying device on people who were under the influence of 5-MeO-DMT. Exactly. So the reactions that were had to this were quite strong, and especially because this person insists that he has the right to, and that he's correctly informing the people, and that he gets consent from people before he administers these practices, which includes putting water up the nose. It includes all sorts of things that the general consensus in the community are unsafe, are traumatizing, and are dangerous. And especially, having these videos on YouTube and the reactions around it and everything. And so the response has been to say, okay, well, if this person's not going to, and my big question too with this person is, and I asked him directly this weekend, is are you informing everybody about all the different ways that 5-MeO practitioners serve the medicine? Do they know that they have options? Or is it this like situation with your friends where it's like, they're like, this is the only person that they know serving this medicine. And so they're like, great, we'll go along with whatever, we'll do whatever, we trust you, you're the man with the tools, the access, the keys to the divine, all these things that occur. And so this has been like a really challenging situation because we don't have recourse. There's no authority that can say you can no longer serve this medicine. Right? This person has the ability and will continue to do things in this way, but the response has been profound in the sense that people have come out and created these protocols and called him out, and there's a big kind of public forum around this. So now if you go and Google his name, you can easily find all the negative information about him, and one would hope that at least somebody is like Googling the name of the person before they go and sit with him, so hopefully that will help. But it's a really challenging thing not having this authority to shut somebody down like that. And then it creates this larger question as to say, well, who are we? And this is where this conversation gets even more challenging and dynamic, because who are we to say what the best practices are, right? And so that's where when you get enough voices together that say we are this group of people representing this body of work, that creates a powerful consortium. So yeah.
And then we really do begin to create standardization in practice. And as I was bringing up earlier about ICers, this is the problem is, eventually, if we want to have psycho-spiritual / indigenous ceremony use, let's say of ayahuasca in this case, legal at some point, you're going to have to present a very strong case of its validity. And with that is going to have to be a doctrine. Somewhere along the line, we need a paper that says, this is what a good ayahuasca ceremony looks like. At that point, it has to be in this case, let's say national consensus of this is what you do and what you don't do. These elements need to be in place, these shouldn't be in place. Then you'll have somebody like this guy come and say, well, I've been doing it this way for 10 years and it works and people love me. Right? So it's a complexity of the conversation that we're in. So before we start just jumping into community dialogue, we want to hear from you, is what we're here for. I will tell you a little story that demonstrates kind of the complexity of the facilitator's side. So I was leading a ceremony, a retreat, out of town, obviously, and there was a woman there whose intention for the ceremony was to explore and release her inhibitions, right? So you already see where that's going. So at some point she became such a handful in the ceremony that we had to move her to another space, which is standard practice. And after the guardians that were supporting all realized that it was beyond their level to deal with her, then finally they had to call me in. You know, so what started off as initially just keeping her from hurting herself, as we always say, your first priority is to make sure the person is not a danger to themselves or others, meaning the other participants. You know, so I'm a strong guy, and it was like riding a bull, right? She's on the bed and she's thrashing about and knocking over lamps and, you know, basically just trying to let her write out her experience to the degree that I can, and only saying what is minimal, because you kind of just want them, as Sita was saying, they're there to be with the plant medicine, not with the facilitator. Key distinction. At some point, you know, I work with a lot of feathers, you know, just kind of clearing space, and at some point in that process, she suddenly said, oh, yeah, strong language, spoiler coming, she suddenly said, oh yes, she opens her legs and says, flat, oh, what is it, feather and fan my clitoris. Oh my God, and then I was like, whoa, you step away from the bed. From that point on, I can't touch her, right? I can't even be near her, because this is what will happen later. If I had been near her in that space, later that would have been interpreted as, you know, I was sexually abused, right? This is what's complex. Not all of the cases of sexual abuse are actually sexual abuse. The person is going through a sexual healing process, and if you're not very, very careful, and it takes a lot of experience to have the discernment, you can easily, without knowing it, move into sexual abuse, or the appearance of it. Right? So all I could do was back away at that point and hold space, let her know that I was there, you know, and basically kind of waited for her. One of the things I teach our guardians is, here's one thing you can count on. Eventually they're going to run out of juice. Right? And you all know what I'm talking about. Eventually the person is just going to wear themselves out, and there's nothing you need to do, right? So at that point, that's the best thing I could do. I just, you know, kept 3 or 4 foot distance. I would say things, let her know that I was there, and meanwhile other related things were coming out of her mouth. And sure enough, eventually the same level of dialogue was there, but it got quieter and quieter. And eventually she's face down on the pillow. You know, like, okay, then I left the room and got a regular guardian, and they just basically waited for her until she was safe, right? Here's the interesting thing. The next day in the sharing circle, she didn't remember any of it, right? Didn't remember, and I remember thinking, while she was saying it, I remember laughing internally like, she's going to be so mortified tomorrow when she realizes that she said these things to me. Didn't remember anything at all. She said she remembered screaming in the main room and waking up in the bed, right? I start off with this story because this is why it's so complex, this whole conversation, you know? What actually is sexual abuse? What's the role of a facilitator when someone moves into that space? What do you do and don't do? You know, when someone tells you I was sexually abused in a ceremony, we have to have the discernment to say, okay, tell me exactly what happened. Like, well, I was having this thing and he had his hand on my chest. That may not be sexual abuse, right? Well, it kind of went down. Okay, yeah, that's sexual abuse, right? It is very similar to what happens when women come in our country and say they've been raped. The first thing that happens is, well, were you asking for it? You know, in this case, those really are valid questions, right? And it becomes very complicated. Yeah. We're going to pass the mic to you, but you two can comment on that.
Yeah, I just wanted to thank you for sharing that, because it is so complex, and these questions of trust, or this idea of trusting the victim, is incredibly important, and allowing the victim to have their truth is incredibly important. But as you're saying, we're adding a layer of such complexity into this that it's incredibly important that we're extremely mindful and careful about the way that we approach each person and individual and issue, so that we can create space so that people feel totally heard and supported, and if we can, help increase the understanding of the circumstance with the people, and so it's a really complex thing. But one thing I wanted to touch on before we jumped out to all of you was this concept of restorative justice. So important. And so this question keeps coming up of, okay, there are bad actors in our community, and I live in a community in the Bay Area where we were really affected by a total leader of the community. This is a really publicly known thing, and I think it's an incredibly important example, so I am going to say the name. Steve Berman founded the Interchange Counseling Institute, and he had thousands of people run through this year-long program on how to be a peer-to-peer counselor, including many of my closest friends. And it ended up that it came out that 6 different women published, I mean, it's all, you can read it in the East Bay Express, that he was their counselor, he invited them over, he fed them psychedelics, and he took sexual advantage of them. And there are 6 occasions that are outlined in a news article that went through wildfire through my community, because this is somebody who's been a leader in on topics like polyamory, on radical love, a relationship coach, on somebody that many people admired and looked up to. And so it was a really shattering reality. And this question became, what do we do? How do we respond to this? You know, and there have been, and what's interesting about this person, and you touched on this a little, is that I've been operating under this idea that the criminal justice system in America is extremely flawed. I personally don't believe in prisons, and that's a whole other topic. We do a whole panel on that. And so there had been men that had gathered around him for years saying, you can't date your students, you're doing things like so-and-so is saying this and that. And so this concept of like, how can we actually get through to perpetrators? Because the problem is, if we just ostracize this person and we expel him from our community, he will just go and prey in another community and create more victims who then don't have the background and information that our community has.
It happens all the time.
And it happens all the time. So this kind of, like, okay, this person's a problem for us, let's get him away from us, and he can be a problem from someone else. That's not a real solution. And there are certain cases, like in this case, where we do need to utilize the criminal justice system because it's bigger and it's out of our hands. But this question becomes like, and I'm going to talk in context of men, but I also really want to acknowledge that men are also abused and in these situations, so it goes both ways. But one of the things that came up a lot in our community is there was this kind of blacklist that was created about perpetrators or people who are misconduct. We're practicing sexual misconduct in our community, and that got passed around to promoters and people who host events, and you know, that information was kind of shared within the community. And then the question became, well, what are we going to do about this list of guys? And the thought was, okay, well, we should create a list of male allies, but it really only works if it's people that they know and respect, to sit them down and come around them and counsel, and while they're calling them out, call them in, and see if that could be something that could work in terms of restorative justice. And so that's one of the ideas that I really am hoping that we can explore as a community, is creating these councils of men and women, it goes both ways, who can go and sit down and call people in and sit in council and do that hard work. And it's very, very difficult work, but I personally don't think that we will accomplish what we're hoping to without some sort of measure like that in place.
Intervention.
Yeah.
I mean, I think these questions are kind of something that our whole country is facing right now. Things are coming to the surface, the shadows are coming to the surface to be healed.
Yeah, the metoo movement is it's happening in the community.
Yeah. And so, you know, it's not as if our just because we have, you know, most of us are doing some kind of inner work and we're facing a lot of the issues that maybe the mainstream as a whole is not exploring quite as much, but we're also you know, just because you take one psychedelic doesn't mean that all of your cultural programming goes away. You know, we still are programmed with a lot of junk that we're working through on an individual level and a community level. So how are we exploring this on an individual level, but as a group, you know? And so, you know, when we're calling people, you know, and at the same time, like, do we want to follow the model of the justice, quote-unquote, system that we have in this country right now? Or are we the visionaries that are going to look and to create and to dream up a better system? And so I think that's something that we can model. I mean, we are all these psychedelic scouts going to the edges and boundaries
and exploring what better ways of doing things, because our current way of doing a lot of things in our culture right now don't work. And so how do we gather what's good from the edges and bring back to the community?
Absolutely. So we're gonna, which I'm looking so forward to, and the whole point of this was to, and like we were saying, this isn't something that we have ideas about it, you know, but starting to talk to all of you and hearing your experiences and your ideas and suggestions, and you know, is so valuable. I want to start by actually passing the microphone to Val, and the reason is Val does this kind of protection work at festivals, right? At Burning Man, at Lucidity, she's what we call a ranger. Her job is to be an intermediary between incidents that happen before the police get involved, right? So she has a lot of frontline experience with dealing with these kinds of issues, and what we're talking about, how do we manage this and get it solved before we have to actually call the police in, basically. And so that's why I wanted to start with
well, can I just say, so again, we only have one microphone, so maybe just for you, we'll have you come and speak. As a general rule, I think what we'll just have is everyone kind of just speak loudly, and if we need to repeat the comment or the question, just because part of what we are doing here is recording this. We don't, it's only on us, so because we want this to go out to a broader community to spark more conversation. So please don't say your name, don't say other people's names, don't talk about facilitators by name. This is really important, and please, you know, make space for everyone to talk. So more ideas and maybe a little less on the processing side.
Great.
Now I don't know what you wanted, because she's shy on me, and then she gave them.
You're shocked, you're ready.
Don't say my name. Well, you're fine.
Oh, that's different.
Tony already outed me. Hi.
Yeah, they're already on.
Well, it's a very noble thing that you're doing. That job is really important, and it came through while we were talking as a model, because that is really, you can all hear me now.
Yeah.
We want to transition
the
away.
video.
Okay. The reason why I thought about you is that what you guys are doing with the Rangers in Burning Man and with the festivals is exactly what we're talking about. You created something that can respond to a problem before we have to call in the traditional authority, right? And kind of direct people on where to go. And yes, that's why I wanted to start.
Yeah, so how that might apply to this. So I have been serving ceremony since 2009, and I've been a ranger since 2012. And those are the two things I do primarily in my life, and the reason I still do both of them is because they're awe-inspiring. They're changing in every way for culture and our communities, and they overlap.
Yeah.
Everything I learn in one applies to the other. So I say that with regard to speaking about rangering, very much applies to how we are guardians and servers in ceremony, and we do our best to say, we've got you. We have each other. What is the #1 commodity we have? Trust. It isn't money. It might be water one day, but it isn't yet. It's getting close. But we have trust. So if I trust you when I'm in trouble, you've got me. So we're there to say, we've got you. And if you need us, or you don't know you need us, but we happen to drop in, we will do everything we can do to be there for you before anyone out there who isn't aligned with the way that we are spiritually, mentally, emotionally, physically, with our community standards and all the things we're trying to do to make shifts. That let's see if we can do this with each other, for each other, in community, connecting with each other before we have to call out there. Right. When we do have to call out there, it's because it is a must call and we legally have to. And there are some must calls where we legally have to. We also still stay present. We have crisis intervention teams, we have mental health department, we have green dots, we have sanctuary, we have Zendo, we have so many alliances, so many skilled people. We don't just be like, this is a must call, I have to call, and now there's someone else and we get to go and, you know, do whatever we were gonna do. As participants, we stay. Even if you have to go to Reno for certain resources, which some people need to go to Reno for certain resources, whether it's medical or care after a traumatic event or something like that, we don't leave. So we stay with our community. Our glue is our community, our commitment to each other, and part of that trust is to be able to say, without intention to slander or to cause harm, because I hope so, right? We don't want to cause harm to ourselves or others or whatnot, but we do need to be honest XYZ is not a safe place to be. XYZ is not a safe person to be with.
Right.
Don't be vulnerable and enter the situation with that. That's just information, and information is something we can share with each other so we have you know, more safety and more alignment within our communities. So, and I wanted to, can I share one more thing?
Yeah, please.
Okay, one of my mentors, I shouldn't say who,
No.
Timothy White from the Shaman's Drum Era Timbo and that whole crew. I love it all so much. Timothy White said something once that really stuck with me, and I've used it as a mantra for how we serve ceremonies and how we hold space and how we train guardians. He said it's all the S's. Set, which is the mental set, right? The mindset. So set, setting, server, song, safety, support. It's all the S's. The sacrament was my last one, but that's really one of the first ones, right? The foundation. So I wanted to share that because that's really helped me like lay out the outline for it and to be able to share with the guardians. It's all the S's. And then we get into all the community, the C's, community, clarity, and so forth. So, too nervous, I'm rambling.
Yeah,
No, it's
can I ask you a question?
Yes, ma'am.
I'll begin into this. Do you have any examples of moderating or mediating a situation that involves sexual misconduct within this community? And share what you can, or if you can't, that's understandable.
I'll share the first one that comes to mind, and it's within this community. It was at Lucidity Festival, which overlaps very much into this community. And it was a situation where there was an alleged sexual assault by a woman, and allegedly happened in front of a tea house, and there were people. So that's a must call. We must inform other people, right? So CIT comes in, other people come in. What I noticed was there was a really strong reaction to what? He did what? Where? How could he? Let's find him. So he hides while everyone's looking, and the lights roll in, and rah, 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 you know, everybody's ready to take him down. And my partner and I were like, we do flame, find out, listen, analyze, mediate, educate. So flame, find out, we talked to her, what happened? She was obviously altered. So we talked to her probably 5 hours. Somewhere around 2.5, 3, she started to come down from her experience. My first thought was, she's altered, he might have been altered.
Right.
So you can say, I couldn't consent because I was altered. Well, he might have not been able to consent when he pulled his things down either because he might have been altered. So who's pointing at who and what's going on? About 5 hours in, after we located her husband, and still had not located the escape artist, but bless his heart, so glad, you know, he managed that for a while and then didn't. But in the process of talking with her and finding her husband and talking to the both of them, my partner and I, counseling and working with them, realized they were actually able to tell us that he had actually had an affair the year before, and her intention was to show him what that felt like, to get him back. And she was too altered to remember or to embarrass, dash, all the other words, to admit it. But after a while, through the reconciliation, there was so much harmony between them. Just from being like, that hurt, well that hurt too, well good, I'm glad you hurt, well that hurt, okay, so now where do we go? And we actually were able to avoid an elongated legal process for everyone involved by getting down to the truth of, I'm hurt.
Perfect example.
I'm hurt, I'm just hurt.
Yeah, that's a perfect example, thank you. A perfect example of the complexity that oftentimes, in the
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
I came to listen, I came to learn.
One of the reasons that it's so complex is that if you're doing this work, mostly, there's definitely just psychonauts that are interested in, you know, human behavior and neurobiology and all of that, but most of us are doing psychospiritual work. And we're working out these very things that you're talking about. And it becomes really complicated, and it's why, going back to what we were talking about, the self-regulation and what are the first steps you take when something happens within our community before we call in authorities? Because I have found most of the time, honestly, maybe 95% of the time when someone has told me there's been sexual abuse, when I talk to them, it turns out it was sexual inappropriateness. It wasn't actually sexual abuse, right? And I'll be very candid. The reason why I know so much about this subject is many years ago I was in a ceremony and the person there was a former lover, right? Exact similar situation, and there was actually a break in the ceremony. And it's like, oh, we're taking this break, So during that period, we were like talking and we were in the bedroom, and one thing led to another, and sure enough, there was a sexual encounter. Still didn't go well. Because what happened later was I got accused of, well, you're the person in charge, you're in power. It doesn't matter that I was feeling that, you should have, so I still got it. Right? So it's a big lesson. It's like, it's just completely inappropriate no matter what. It didn't matter that there was a former relationship, that it felt really mutual to me because of the altered state and the fact that I'm in this facilitation role. I'm in the, I think what was the title? The power really got me. And the title of the talk? Something about power and sexual abuse, yeah. What the person kept telling me was, it didn't matter how they felt because I was in the position of power, which was true. Like, they were basically like taking their cues from me, right? And because I made it okay, it seemed okay. In retrospect, they realized that I should have been the one to put the brakes on, and they were right.
Yeah, thanks for sharing that, Tony. It actually really is quite meaningful that you shared that story, and I think it helps all of us understand just how, this is complicated, and to not conflate the practitioner with the human being,
right.
I mean, or do conflate those, because we are just human beings, and this pedestal that practitioners are put upon, it can end up creating really unhealthy dynamics on so many different levels. And so it's part of this practice and this awareness when you are going and working with somebody that you might deeply admire and be inspired from, that we also just have that recognition in all our interactions. Should definitely be part of the educational pamphlet that is made, hopefully.
Make a pamphlet?
Yeah, something about these things. So yeah, does anyone have any comments or questions?
Yeah, just speak loudly.
We're going to drop the mic at this point and just move into Q&A.
Well, I just want to turn. So
Yeah, great, and we can repeat
Okay.
what you said too.
So just as a background, I have 30 years of working with ayahuasca and plant medicine and psychedelics. And I have 30 years of working as a teacher of conscious relationship and what I would now call a focus on erotic wellness and transpersonal love.
Beautiful.
So my contribution to this is there's an important distinction that I've begun to make, which seems to be very useful for people. It certainly is for me. And that is, what is sex and what isn't sex?
Right.
Okay? I always say right now we live in a world called talk and fuck.
Mm-hmm.
Because if we're going to do things with somebody of the opposite sex, we will talk. And then if we're going to do anything else, we start liquid kissing. Liquid is sex. Liquid turns on the engine in the body. It opens the neural pathways. It creates chemical reactions and starts a drive that can overtake your mind, right? If you have a clear distinction, oh, sensuality is weight, it's touch, it's not going to the places the liquid comes from. So no tongues, no portals, okay? You can stay out of the drive. You can be naked, moving, beautiful energy, going to glory, taking the sexual energy to art and beauty and intimacy that's
devotion,
profound. And you won't have the push in your body. So I do this, I have done this with thousands of people, and I will often say, so how does this feel? We've been naked a long time, we're moving on the floor, we're creating beauty through our sexual energy. How does it feel? Is there a push in your body? No, there's no push in my body. How does that feel? Fabulous, right? So one thing is this distinction. So instead of worrying about what do we do after it happens, let's get it into our heads before it happens, because I'm worried about the Me Too movement, because since we don't have that distinction, men are scared to touch at all now, right? So, and those children that were taken away from their parents, the rule was people couldn't touch the children.
Right.
Well, how horrible is that? We have to touch. Touch is essential. So let's get a good distinction in our minds between what causes the body to get sexual drive going and what doesn't. And I suggest that it's liquid. And then the other piece to speak to is that in order to really have erotic wellness in our world, we have to take the sexual relationship from personal to transpersonal.
Absolutely.
We have to have places where you can go. I say, we get our nails done, we should be able to get our yonis done. You know, some place to go, whether you look, however heavy, rich, whatever, you can get attention to your body that heals you and helps you, and same thing for men. So we really have to, you know, I wrote an article that said, until we acknowledge, address, and provide for the erotic needs of our society, we will not resolve the fundamental ills of our society.
It will remain a pathology.
So what I'm excited about, for years, I couldn't talk about ayahuasca to anybody, nobody even knew, and you know, I went to the event this weekend, and I'm so happy to be here. Thank you, dear. I found out about this a half hour ago. And, you know, but I'm very excited to have a place to talk passionately and openly and in communion about the value of psychedelics. And I believe that the other main thing we can do as a community is start leading in erotic wellness. That would be a blessing.
Yeah, okay, I was going to say something as well. But yeah, I mean, I think that you bring up some really important points. Is like how are we, you know, starting to heal the masculine energy and heal the feminine energy in our community, so that we and also as individuals model what healthy femininity and masculinity looks like, and in relationship. It's something that we're all grappling with.
Yeah, I'm so glad you actually spoke first for that very reason, because the conversation underneath this conversation is, why is there so much sexual abuse? And why is it coming up, right? And then what you brought up is a conversation we can't avoid, which is the fact that we're sexual beings. However, depending on the culture that we're in, it's usually our sexuality is running hand in hand with pathology in some way, right? That it's been oppressed, suppressed, and of course you go to, in this case, my case, more often than not, an ayahuasca ceremony, and suddenly, boom, kundalini rising, and I'm a sexual being, and it's okay for me to be sexual. Like, of course, what have I been thinking? That guy's really beautiful, he's singing, I'll go give it to him. Right? Or, you know, she's amazing, she's a guardian, I bet she'll respond. You know, this is what happens when a suppressed, unhealthy relationship with sensuality, eroticism, and actual sexuality collapse, right, in ceremony. And that's why this conversation, I think, is so timely, and also, again, complicated, right? Because people are having sexual healing in ceremony. Of course they are, you know? In fact, I would say in the last 23 years, what most people end up having at some point is healing with sexuality, and how it overlaps into everything else, basically, right? So understanding, like, there is a reason why the sexual abuse is running rampant. We still need to be in conversation about what's appropriate and inappropriate, right? So,
yeah, I just want to... Yeah, I think all of this is incredibly important. And one thing that Ashley touched on too, and that we're saying is conversation and communication, and having good models. I'm constantly like, where are our models, right? Who's modeling the best kind of behavior? And then it's so taboo to talk about it. It's taboo to bring these things up with our friends in our communities. Well, it has been traditionally, where we kind of are very good at breaking molds around here. But for especially the more general society and the broader culture, which, by the way, we're all hoping to kind of come on board with our programs over the next couple of years, it's important that we acknowledge that these things there's no forum for discussion. There's no good examples of having this conversation. Even the way that young men speak to each other, teenage boys, about women. And I don't know if any of you have any exposure to that. It is so damaging. It is so traumatizing. It is so unhealthy. So it creates the conditions for the reality that we're in to proliferate. And so this question of like, how do we start that education at a much younger, and we're looking at this in the microcosm of our community and how it impacts us, but it's about the macrocosm as well, and what we learned here we can hopefully bring out. And I think there's a lot of opportunity, and one thing I'd like to see in our community of people who are exploring self-awareness is to really, men and women, talk to each other, really talk to each other. Be honest with the people that you care about in your life about your own experiences and your own misprints. I had a phenomenal conversation with a friend of mine misprints, imprints. I had a conversation with a really dear friend of mine who told me that he has a very odd imprinting that orients him towards pedophilia. Yeah. And it was, my first reaction was like, oh my God, I can't believe you're sharing this with me. And we ended up having this 2-hour conversation. We both cried. It was unbelievable. And I understood where it came from in him, and him kind of coming out about it was part of his healing process. Wow. And so that degree, and like this person's also hosting men's circles all over the world right now, and working on how do we have these difficult and challenging experiences about the ways in which we were conditioned that aren't healthy or serving society or the people in society. And I found it to be really inspiring.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Absolutely. So,
the comments.
Come, please.
Yeah. Just speak loudly.
So I think I'm really grateful that you brought that up about your friend coming out about pedophilia, because I do want to counter the narrative that it's a problem that we have as a society that people aren't having their eroticism fulfilled. Like, I do think that is something to take into account. But in thinking about when we identify what's inappropriate and appropriate touch, we have to think about that people also have triggers due to trauma that they incurred at an earlier part of their life. So I think we have to talk about what it means to ask for permission, and just also, it's just never appropriate when someone is in an altered state and someone has a power dynamic, because it's also important to recognize that the pattern, or a pattern amongst perpetrators, is that abuse is a form of domination and forcing someone into a position of subordination. It is a manipulative act. So it's not just about their eroticism being fulfilled or not. It's an act to dominate. And something I also want to propose is I lived in a cooperative of 124 students in next to UC Berkeley's campus, and in response to sexual violence that was happening within the co-op, I designed consent workshops that I began to offer to the membership. And there was change over time, but
That's great.
Yeah, we did have to respond to incidences even after the consent workshops were happening, and it's definitely been something that I've been trying to think of how best to follow up with the harmed and the perpetrators, for sure. But consent workshops and trying to create the structure for consent education certification. And if someone doesn't have the certification, then they're not certified in consent pedagogy.
I would like to help me to move the conversation on. I want to pose questions, actually. I would like the first one to be your opinion on what you would actually like to see, right? If a friend comes to you and says, I sat in an ayahuasca ceremony this weekend or did before, whatever, and I'm not positive, but I'm pretty sure the facilitator took advantage of me. I would like your opinion on it. What kind of response would you like to see happen? Like, what would you like to see in place?
And I'll also say, just as a general context, we're dreaming up what we want this to look like. Exactly. And if we can't even dream up what we want to see, how are we going to get there? So,
So that's the question we're posing. That's what we're looking for.
I'll save that question to the end. But what occurs to me is, I've been doing sort of workshops for 20-some years, in ceremony for as long, since the early 90s. In some of the most powerful workshops, it's a combination of what everyone has been talking about, and that that sexual urge is sort of dissipated or diffused when there's a conversation around it, and it's copped to, right? In the same way that a good workshop starts out where everyone talks about the elephants in the room, like, hey, confidentiality, is everybody in? And everybody acknowledges that, yeah, we're going to be confidential. Or, yes, sexual urge may come up in ceremony. Talk about it ahead of time. Yeah. And that creates, and talk about the boundaries. That may come up, and there is no touching among participants, and certainly not between the facilitator and participants. And that creates a safe container for people to actually express what's coming up by sort of admitting to it. one of the things I'll do, for example, when I'm dating someone new, and I can tell that, wow, there's big attraction here, but I'm not ready to dive in. She's not ready, but, and so what I'll do is bring up that conversation and say, hey, let's take sex off the table. And for a minute, we're just gonna, that's not gonna happen. And then we both noticeably relax, and we can hang on each other a little bit and whatever, and just know that, like, oh wow, we don't
and know that not every move is going to be interpreted as
that weird
a sexual
thing where like you push pull, and we can just like leave that out of the room for a minute. So that's what I'd like to see in ceremony, as sort of acknowledgement, and certainly a vow and a verbalization by the facilitators, like they do what occurs to me at Spirit Rock, a Buddhist community up north. 90 days, they absolutely, once they take on a student, just in a meditation teacher, there's a seniority, there's a statutory discrepancy that happens when a student comes to a teacher. And they say that you have to have no contact for 90 days before initiating a romantic relationship with someone who was your student. No contact for 90 days. And that, that seems like enough time, and if there really is something there, you can then reach out and see if that spark is actually there or just something that was sort of result of that statutory relationship.
I just want to thank you because you brought up two actual tangible things, right? Which is what we're looking for. One is maybe the standardization of practices that all facilitators are required to say something like you did. Okay, just want you to know there's going to be no sexual, sexual urges come up in ceremony. It's completely fine. It's welcome here. We're not going to be touching you even if you ask for it. That would be great because it'll set it. And the other would be, and if you are interested in somebody in ceremony, wait 90 days. Right? So this, what we're looking for is these kind of...
That same imprinting can happen among participants. I fall in love every time with like everybody in the room.
Absolutely. Let me raise my hand. Every single time.
Can I add something?
Please.
Even though I talked a lot. First of all, I'm required to say I spoke as a person who is a ranger, not for behalf of the ranger department, blah, blah, fear-based stuff.
Yes.
Second thing, we have a code of conduct, a code of ethics, and counseling beliefs that not only the sitters but the guardians must adhere to. We have a responsibility as servers and guardians to follow a 6-month, not 90-day, 6 months from the date of contact, and we can't control that for the sitters outside of ceremony, but on the night, in ceremony, we are 100% responsible to make sure that nothing happens in a state of vulnerability, and I think that's with regard to what you were saying, Senator, like we say it and no touching, and sometimes people do things, and to actually, like we did recently, had a woman guardian step in twice, 2 nights in a row, with the same female participant who was very much, from what I felt was a compassionate guidance, in so much pain and seeking what she needed from the next male that wasn't aware yet and would give it. And we had the same female both nights intervene, not only to protect her, but to protect the next male. She was hungry, and they didn't know. They weren't around long enough to know. We knew. So to take that responsibility, if someone brought it up to me, I wasn't aware, or brought it up that something was brought up about me, I feel like in answering your question just a moment ago, I want to hear from someone I know that directly, here's what, not just, we've been hearing things, no, on Friday night, this example, I'm here to talk to you about it, give me a chance, talk to me, tell me it's there, and let's go, anywhere we need to go from there, but not 3 months later in this vague, there's been a couple of reports, I don't know what that, so I want direct, to answer your question, I want straight up, and if it's me having to talk, I want to do it, if it's you having to talk to me, I want to hear it.
Great. Again, concrete examples, if we're talking about what questions do we ask of facilitators before we step in with them, asking them, do you have a code of ethics that you facilitate under?
That's a great idea.
And if they don't, maybe they should. Or if they,
Yeah, and one thing I'll add in that is as part of this informing at the beginning of the ceremony, or maybe it's hey, everyone gets sent this code of ethics, but it's having a line in there that says, if something does happen, I want to know about it right away after, and here's the way. And if you want to be anonymous about it, here's an email address you can email, and just making sure that people know that that resource is there and calling attention to that.
I just think that's such a great idea. I'm loving this conversation because it's going where we hoped it would. Just hearing tangible things, because I would imagine through the AWARE project and the work we do collectively, it would be nice to actually present a document at the end of this and say, here's some ideas that came from our meeting. And that would be another one. You know, maybe there needs to be something that actually says, yeah, there could be something that says, like you're saying, that most facilitators send out some kind of documentation that explains their ceremony. That could and probably should include, if you feel that you were abused or taken advantage of in any way, here's what we'd like you to do. Then you're letting them know right away that here's a safe place, and please contact me right away, don't wait 3 months, or, yeah.
I was just gonna add, and it just came up, that there should also be an option if somebody had a problem with you or someone as a facilitator, right, that like, just so you know, this resource exists, right? And this is kind of the larger infrastructure that we're working on. And I know at MAPS we have something that's part of our protocols, which there is a reporting mechanism. If somebody has a bad experience with any MAPS trained therapist, we actually have a way for you to report that and the steps that we take to follow up with that. And so having that kind of like, my ideal would be that there was some sort of third-party group that could receive these sorts of complaints. Obviously that's a complicated thing to call out of thin air into reality, but yeah.
What if there was a facilitators congress? What if there was a group that was where you could go to if there was a problem?
Here's the problem. Well, we both are. We all are. We were talking about this earlier, and we're all going to speak to this. I'm going to be really brief. The challenge with that is we need to protect the confidentiality of people, right? So, well, what I'm not talking about someone who's perpetuated a crime, an abuse. In general, what I'm discovering is that most small communities, like Northern California or San Francisco, LA, because a lot of those facilitators know each other, that's in place often. We have it here in LA. We get the word that, oh, so-and-so has had 3 complaints. Okay, let's get on the phone and call them and find out what's going on. But what we've been talking about is how do we do that in a public way? So if something happens to your friend in ceremony, I need somebody to call. We're still figuring out how to do that and protect all parties involved without outing anybody or bringing unnecessary attention.
Yeah, I mean, we talked about, it was like, well, do we form kind of like a council of some kind of intervention or mediation? But then the other issue is like, okay, hypothetically, like we're this council or something because we're standing as public leaders in this community. But then what kind of liability are we taking on if someone tells us, oh, I've been abused, but then, and then how are we kind of getting sucked into this process or potentially need to report something, and I'm non-complicit, yeah, and I'm moving to become a therapist, and then am I, if somebody says something to me and I'm like legally mandated to report it, so it gets complicated quickly. There is a woman on the East Coast that has put together, Katherine Maclean had put together an email called, what was the email address? I can't remember off the top of my head. I'll look it up right now on my phone. Yeah. For people, particularly for women, to kind of report or seek support for exactly these kinds of issues. And that actually led to some change because a couple people kind of got several people reports about a number of people, and then they were actually taken off of the from being hosted at a conference because of these reports. So there is some kind of recourse that is happening, but then it also gets in danger of like, well, does this become a witch hunt?
Yeah, totally. And I'll just want to add one thing, which is that there are efforts being made. And I can't speak too much about it. There's a lot happening kind of behind the scenes right now, but there are efforts being made, especially for people who are going to be practitioners in an above ground way, to create this kind of national, international council of people who, it's a professional association essentially. So that's a really promising thing that I think will help a lot. It doesn't answer the questions that we have around work that might not be above board. And so we still are kind of left with the same challenges and how to mitigate certain things. But my hope is that when we have a more legal framework to operate under, then maybe we can create this. But I'd like to see us model things out as a community so we can understand what works, what doesn't work, what do people need, and how to actually functionally do this.
Well, I'm having an idea right now. I don't know if it's the right one, but if you in these underground circumstances know each other, right, and then you hear of a certain misconduct, right, instead of calling someone, how about having then like a board of 3 people that will like go physically and have a face-to-face conversation right away, and maybe even bring in the victim and try that and have that healing.
That's exactly what we do.
Place.
And just really brief history, just to kind of let you know where we're at. I love that Leona spoke to early on. Like, we're figuring all this out, right? Part of the reason is, it's obvious when you think about it, most of the people that have been leading and facilitating ceremony, whether in group context or individually, for years were underground by necessity, right? Now we're in the psychedelic renaissance, and we're starting to find out, like, you know, right in the next city, there's somebody who's been practicing 10 years for 2,000 people, right? So we're all just starting to kind of learn who we all are. So alliances are starting to be built, you know, and there's like 8 or 9, let's say, you know, ceremonial groups that all know of each other, and we do that on purpose because now we can like make recommendations. Someone can come to me and say, I'm looking for this particular kind of thing. Oh, you should go to so-and-so. Or this person's not right for us, go there. What has also been helping is, hey, have you heard about so-and-so's work? I've been getting some reports that there's some, you know, shit going down. And we'll talk about it, the facilitators, and then, okay, we need to do an intervention of some kind. So that is happening. The challenge is, again, how do we do that in a way that's more public and serves more people without bringing unnecessary harm and attention to people?
Just to quickly piggyback on that, and I know I'm taking up more time, but you know, that's for intervention. But how about for education? Like, how about having that little council and going in and saying, hey, you know, we're just checking in with you. What are your practices? Here's what we do. What do you think about, you know, here's the template, if you agree with it. And I mean, in my little non-medicinal group where we do just connection practices, it's just talk. We don't start anything without agreements. And in my first ceremony, I got a lot of history, I got a lot of background, I got a lot of like technology, and I had still no clue what the ceremony was going to look like until I got there. And when I got there, I assumed that the guardians are now going to be drinking so that I could feel protected. And when I saw that everybody was drinking, I spent the whole night in a corner, right? And it wasn't a divine experience until I later learned what it looks like, and then it was. But you know, like educating and making sure that the facilitators are adhering to that standard.
How do we? Let me. I'm just going to jump in to close this loop. So Katherine Maclean, she has an email address. It's hello@psychedelicwomen.com.
Great.
So I'll repeat that. hello@psychedelicwomen.com. It's also on our event page about this event at the bottom. So that's it. I mean, she's at least sticking a flag in the ground in that respect. I mean, I kind of think of that as maybe for a broader sense of things, but I'd really like to see these issues being done and dealt with on a local level, which is what we're doing here.
What were we going to say?
I was going to say, it just also piggyback back on what you were saying about education.
Can you speak up?
I think that I think at the core of it, the power resides in the participant, and if we're able to educate the participants, figure out a way to ultimately empower them to know what is right and wrong,
and how to make choices in the beginning, like in terms of like who you're going to sit with and where.
Right. You know, and one idea that popped into my mind is you know, ceremonies are a very personal thing, and ultimately, if we try to narrow it down and pop it into this model, people may not be able to find exactly what it is. You know, and so perhaps maybe there is some sort of just 10 core rules that are tacked on to that first introduction email that goes out and says, you know, here's my whole thing, and then at the very bottom it says, please follow this link, and this is essentially, although, you know, I may use feathers in my ceremony, and this guy uses chickens, at the core of it, I adhere to these core rules right here.
Yeah. And that goes back to the overall term we use as a standardization of practice.
Yeah.
Like, we have to agree that
Or at
these
least
are the 10 things that are bare minimum.
Yeah. So that we have room to experiment, but that there's a bare minimum agreement.
Standard of care,
Yeah, and then how, you know, I think I sit there and I'm like, well, how does that get out there? You know, not everyone is privy to the Aware Project and the wealth of information that's coming out of here. How do we do that?
Yeah, I'd like to propose that administrators, anyone who's facilitating, I'd like to propose that we can't count on the participants. I'd love to have information be so available to everyone that participants are going to get all the information and have the most informed consent that they could possibly give to the experience. But I think that the duty at this time falls on the facilitator to be providing all this information, and that perhaps it's also the facilitator's duty in this moment to come together and determine what are those 10 core foundational principles of safety that everybody adheres to no matter what.
I'd also like to add that we also have somebody here who just recently wrote a book about this, and I mean, not this particular subject, but just in general, the core practices and things like that.
Cool, yeah.
Awesome.
And, you know,
two people actually.
Yeah. 2 people.
What's the book?
Yeah, so Charles and Minter are here, and they wrote a book recently called The Facets of Ayahuasca, and it will be coming out later. So Charles is back there, and Minter's here if you'd like to say hello to them later.
Yeah,
Did you have something?
Yeah. So I'm a data person, so I look at technology and how it can help, and how you could still maybe hold all of this data in a database, but still not have it exposed publicly, and have only the results available to this council of 3, or what it is. And it's still going to be up to the participants to answer some sort of a survey. Did the facilitator do these 10 things? Can you provide feedback? Do you need any further assistance with this facilitator afterwards? And when you send that first introduction email to ceremony, you send a link to the council. Here are the standards that we're trying to uphold in the ceremony. After the ceremony, here's a survey, and here's a link to the council, right? And so you have that self-reporting system, right, where each facilitator gets some sort of an internal ranking that you don't really share, but maybe what someone could do is like search by a group name or search by a person's name, not being able to pick by a list or not being able to search through the database, but just a quick return if it hits the exact name. So that way you couldn't just search if you didn't know.
And something like the Aware Project / that's the kind of conversation we love to have, a breakout conversation with you. Because we're very aware when we started this whole process of creating this conversation tonight. Ultimately, we're going to have to respond with something official, you know. And we thought, well, it still has to start with this dialogue, you know, getting ideas from you. You know, I'm getting quite a few tonight, actually, and that would be one of them. You know, we need some way for someone to, like this woman's email address, like, hey, I was at so-and-so ceremony last week, and I'm pretty sure I got abused, right? Right? Then we have to, how are they reporting it, and how are we going to respond to it? And this is what we mean by it's all new. Right? We're creating it.
So
can I just add one thing to that?
Yes.
Yeah, sorry. I do actually think there's probably some really great technological tools that we can use that have privacy embedded into them, and I'm really loving this concept, and it's something I've thought a lot about with all the, you know, people and practitioners. Is like, hey, is anyone doing like outcomes studies or surveys or like checking in, and having this sort of general form that people can fill out that all goes into a centralized thing is actually like a really good resource in general for understanding the outcomes and impacts of this work. So I think that's a great idea.
And it's scary for the provider that took that risk too, though. And
it is.
This idea has been kicked around for a while, and it's like,
and for good reason. Let's assume that, like, so I have a really good reputation with the work that I do, and I can tell you, you know, for every 10 people that think I'm amazing, there's one that had an awful experience, and it's my fault, right? So we are appropriately cautious about the idea of a database where 10 eccentric people that took out and worked out their personal father issues on you have now told everybody that you're a bad facilitator, right? So this is the other, that's why it's complicated. It's like, we gotta find a way that it can be fair, and it can't simply be like a Yelp, you know? Because every facilitator in the room has a story of no matter what they did, the person still thought they were horrible and abused them. And it wasn't the case at all, right? So it is complex in that sense.
That would be 90%. So pretty good.
Yeah, I'm doing pretty good.
Transference is a powerful
Transference.
tool. So we've been going for a while now, and I'm sensitive to time. I know this is still very juicy.
We still want to hear from you.
I know. So I'm just trying to think about how we want to do this, because maybe we can take one more question and discuss a little bit more, and then what we'll do is go through this video, write down the notes, and then maybe it's the kind of thing that we put out publicly as some statements around some ideas. You know, this video is going to go out, so we want, you know, everyone else that's going to be watching this video to spark the dialogue, and, you know, maybe they are creating sort of these data platforms that can, you know, safely as a way to, you know, or coming up with codes of ethics, you know, there are things like that out there. The Guild of Guides is a great website to check out in terms of some ethical practices. But it also has to do with every single one of you. You know, you are all here because you're passionate about this stuff, which means you've sat or are a facilitator yourselves. So this, you know, these conversations need to go out and spark more conversations amongst your friends, your communities, the people that you sit with. Encourage your facilitators that you sit with to look at some of the stuff that's come out of this. You know, I personally invited a whole bunch of facilitators to this meeting. A lot of them couldn't make it or didn't come. So, you know, the information needs to get out there, and I think Liana's right. At this point, you know, I think getting to the facilitators themselves is maybe a better, I mean, well, do everything. You know, talk to your friends, share this information, encourage your facilitators.
Yeah, and then I just want to make a suggestion that maybe the Aware Project hosts a working group in the future about that. Yeah.
Right. So, and the other idea was like, okay, what other spaces need to be created? So, this was our first foray into this community dialogue space. Is there a need for, you know, a healing, you know, women's group space? Is that needed? Do we need another working group? Do we need another discussion like this?
But do we need a meeting to educate men on what sexual abuse is? Like you said, you know.
Yeah, like a meeting about consent.
Yeah, do we need a meeting about consent? Like all this shit. Yeah, because you know, one of the things I've learned over the years doing this work is anytime I take it for granted, you know, here's an example. You know, before a ceremony, we do agreements. And the first one is, don't leave the ceremony until the ceremony ends. It seems like such a no-brainer, but all the facilitators in the room know that people will, out of their minds, pack up and try to leave in the middle of a ceremony, right? And so I'm learning that you can't take anything for granted. You know, maybe we do need forums where we talk about very obvious things, like this is really inappropriate behavior in a ceremony.
Well, and then how do we create an inviting space to have those conversations? Because that's a really difficult.
Because they all run, because they're rebels. My work is perfect. I don't need to be at your work.
Yeah. So you know, maybe it needs to be packaged in more of a like, let's be safe facilitators, Skillshare or something, rather than like.
We want to hear from you and your experience, and come show. That's how you invite them.
Yeah, exactly.
We know you're amazing and perfect. Please come share with us.
Yeah. So we'll have maybe one more comment and just speak really loudly.
Yeah. I was thinking of like a proposal where part of the standards of this type of facilitation.
Right here.
Oh, funny, the person speaking.
Yeah, oh, there it is.
That's me. I'll be right out. Yeah. So part of the standard and code of these ethics is absolutely mandatory post integration, and part of that integration can be the conversation of like, what was your experience? Yes. Can you elaborate more beyond the sharing circles that already may or may not happen as post each ceremony or each whatever. So in the case of like protecting someone's information on both parties and having it in this online database that everybody's information is compromised, than having it be a more personal, interpersonal dialogue between the participant and the facilitator. It's like, tell me exactly what it is, everything that came up, even the imprints or whatever, so that there's more clarity in the conversation and where that person was actually coming from and what was actually happening. And like that could be part of the standardization of these codes of ethics, like integration, like even part of the orientations, what's consent, this is what we don't do in ceremony, this is what we do in ceremony, like this is what might happen, so when this happens, don't be scared, like this is just part of it, somebody may be happy, whatever. Like just part of these things that are protocols that already are happening in ceremonies that look safe, that are safe, or that if they're not happening, then these maybe principles should be instituted as part of their orientation, preparation, and post-integration and interpersonal dialogue between participants and facilitators.
Great.
More integration all around.
That's a whole other
that is so critical and key to all of this, and more focused integration and going through these questions and really working with people, so necessary. These are just tools, and the integration is as important as the ceremony. More.
Yeah. Are there any like final? Yeah. Someone that didn't speak there wanted to just share something brief.
And just loudly.
So some of the major points that are sticking out to me, kind of in the big picture, are 4 things. One is prevention, right? And that's all based on prior agreements.
The education.
In the midst of it, one idea that was coming to me is accountability. So somebody to hold the leader accountable. Maybe that's guardians or somebody who's like with them that can help hold them accountable in that gray area and in the complex space. So prevention, accountability. And then when something does happen, something that comes to mind as well is mediation, like we were talking about. So bringing the people together and having the communication happen to help that healing process. And then the 4th thing that comes to mind is reporting. And in terms of having written documentations and recording the experiences to share to help educate all of our other brothers and sisters.
Yeah. Okay, and our last comment?
Yes, kind of piggybacking along on what you were just saying, particularly on the mediation point, would be interesting, just like the Code of Ethics, maybe have a psychedelic mediation council of a few respected people that you just publicize on your own, so that if there is some issue, you're sort of soliciting, if there's an issue, come to this council, and then, as a neutral party. So you're not actually saying that you're facilitators or anything to try and get around the confidentiality issue. So that people would feel like, well, there's some place I can go, like the Better Business Bureau or, some concept like that.
Thank you.
It's a great idea.
Okay, I had something I was going to say at the end.
Can't help it.
Oh, yes, that's what it was. So obviously this has brought up probably a lot more comments than we have time for here. Please use the Facebook event page and put your comments in there if you had something you wanted to share. We'll go through that and then put any other kind of new comments or ideas into the existing document, just so that we can kind of keep the conversation going a little bit. The AWARE project also has a community forum page on Facebook. That could be another space. Also, Interspace Integration has the same thing. So there's also a lot of online forums to be able to continue this conversation. The next event that we're doing in July 18th on the east side in Hollywood, we are having a new venue, just for people who go to that space typically. So the other kind of part of this community dialogue that we wanted to have was around race and diversity and privilege within this community, because it's something that is continuing to come up around how do we also be in good relationship with the cultures that we're using practices and different things from. So we're going to have another panel, another community discussion around that. The event page is not up yet, but it will be soon. Anything else along those lines? Okay. And actually, on those lines, Paula, do you want to talk about your event? And maybe want to grab one of your flyers just to...
Absolutely.
So Paula gave a talk at Lightning in a Bottle, which is a festival around here recently, and now she's putting together something. So you want to start right here?
Just come over here. So I'll try to be brief. I went to a Sacred Plants conference in Mexico in February, and I connected with representatives of indigenous communities, and we formed an organization called Cosmovisiones Ancestrales, and the goal of this organization is to build a bridge and to mediate understanding between psychedelic researchers and psychedelic consumers in the Western world, and to reduce the harm that can be done ecologically and culturally when we don't build solidarity with indigenous land right movements, and also to build a bridge with the migrant justice movement, because a lot of folks who are forced to migrate are indigenous. So we need to talk about accountability, like you said, and transitional justice in the psychedelic community, and how we fight really hard to make the medicine accessible to those who are most targeted by state violence and legacies of colonialism and slavery. So we have lots of campaigns, and I'm working on making it a 501c3 organization, but this is to organize a conference for the week of Indigenous Peoples Day, and to mobilize the funds for travel for 7 representatives of indigenous communities in Mexico and Colombia. So we're fundraising. If you want to learn more, please talk to me after the event. And we have 20 flyers, so if you don't get one, maybe ask someone to take a picture. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Paula. Okay. I think that's about it. I haven't been looking at my notes like I normally do. Thank you all so much for coming to this event. I would just take a moment to just kind of let this kind of maybe close our eyes and just kind of sit with it a little bit. And then Sky is going to come up here and end with a little bit of beautiful music to kind of help us ground all in. So maybe she can set up while we're having this moment. So I encourage you to just, turn your eyes down to your laps or close your eyes and just take a moment to let all of this sink in. Oh, she's setting up here. Sky is part of the I'm Life Tea House, which is up at the back and has been serving you tea all night. So it's a pleasure to have her up here, sharing her beautiful music and her brightness. So thank you for being here, and thank you to the I Am Life Tea House for serving us nourishing beverages this evening. So taking a moment to call back in that inward space as we look to solidify the teachings and the lessons from tonight, and carry these teachings as medicine in ourselves out into the world.
So one more piece, a short prayer to each of you as we go out into the world. May your feet kiss the ground they walk upon. May your heart always know the path it's destined to be on. May your hands do the work that's meant to be as we co-create a new reality. May your soul know its depths as it takes flight. May your love never need a reason why. May your light inspire purpose in all who dare to see as we do the work that heals humanity. And we walk in noble service to the Queen.
Thank you all so much for coming. It's been a blessing to share this space with you. Thank you for sharing your hearts and your ideas. And I look forward to seeing you again in community. Thank you.